this.
Okay. So do you think he had, you mentioned he was a little different, a little bullied and stuff growing up. Do you think there was an aspect of the, I don't know, almost like mad scientist experimentation he was doing across all these different projects that was based on him feeling a sense of power?
I I hesitate to say that. One of the reasons why is because the structure of MK Ultra isn't what many people think that it is. So it's not as if Gottlieb is doing these experiments. For the most part, he's funding people who are already doing these experiments. This is what sometimes people don't realize about MK Ultra. It's not George White in Operation Midnight Climax being the main exception. What mostly is happening with these sub-projects is that there are researchers at universities and prisons and hospitals that are already doing these experiments, and they're already publishing about them. Even though it's kind of crazy to think about, you're dosing these people with drugs, sometimes they aren't really giving informed consent, and you're publishing about this, but that's what they were doing. And Sidney Gottlieb sees this, and so he decides to fund them so they continue doing that so he can learn whether it leads to anything. So that's kind of the structure. It's not that MK Ultra initiates all of these experiments. In many cases, it's just trying to make sure that these experiments continue happening. So
Right, but if you're doing things like some of those 149 projects where there's a power dynamic to it. Midnight Climax is just the best example. You would think that the person who's running that, I'm not saying it means it, but you might be suspicious that there's a level of pleasure they get from that. Like basically almost like I'm here in the ivory tower and all these types of people who would have made fun of me, they're just the regular plebs of society and we'll do what we want to try to show them how the big boys run society.
Yeah, that might be a part of it. And also, I wouldn't discount what you mentioned there, kind of the pleasure of it. In many instances, not necessarily the sub-projects that he's not doing himself, but in many instances, it does seem like he is trying to be one of the boys.
Right.
He's trying to, let's do this funny prank on this guy because it'll be fun at the office. For example, let's put some LSD into the punch bowl at the holiday party and see what happens. And then a guy drinks it and he ends up like going insane for that night and running around and they can't find him and he almost gets hit by a car. So that's the kind of thing.
Wait, that wasn't Wormwood guy, was it?
No, that wasn't Frank Olson.
Right.
Yeah, this is a different thing, but it's similar to that kind of story. But yeah, it is kind of Sidney Gottlieb's story. I do think he's trying to fit in a lot of ways. And if, hey, they're joking around with each other, here's a practical joke I can do. I can place LSD within some of this stuff. And, at the same time, I can see how they react to it. So I can learn something about it and I can justify this by saying, I'm just for national security. But really, yeah, I'm trying to be one of the boys.
Did you, we were talking about that off camera. You saw that Wormwood documentary on Netflix several years ago, right? So what was that guy's name? Frank
Olson.
Frank Olson. And what was the story there again for people who haven't seen that?
Yes, he was a bacteriologist in what's called Fort Detrick. That's the country's biological warfare installation. So he was in charge of kind of developing biological weapons that could be dropped, if need be, whether they be anthrax bombs or something else. So his specialty was the airborne distribution of pathogens. So he was involved in several experiments like that. He and a group within the Fort Detrick called the Special Operations Division, a group of scientists mostly who were involved in that kind of stuff, they occasionally met with the people who were involved in MK Ultra from the CIA. So they would meet at this retreat called Deep Creek, and they would exchange information. They often cooperated with each other. If the CIA needed some kind of biological something, they would get it from Fort Detrick. And if they needed information about how someone reacted to whatever, they would get it from the CIA. So they would share information about their experiments. And at one of these experiments at Deep Creek, Sidney Gottlieb and his underling, Robert Lashbrook, another chemist, they decided we're going to dose everyone with LSD and you're going to see what happens. So they put some LSD into the liquor and they started pouring, bottles for everyone or shots for everyone, except for a couple people. One guy had a heart problem, so they didn't give it to him. And another one was a reformed alcoholic, and they thought, well, we're not going to give him any either. So a few people were spared, but Frank Olson is one of the people who got the LSD that night. And, in this book, I have during the depositions, Gottlieb and Lashbrook are questioned in depth about, how it all went down, how they poured it and all this stuff. So if anyone's interested, there's a lot more detail that they give to how that night went down. But Frank Olson gets this LSD, and most of the people who are there, the room starts spinning, they start seeing hallucinations, they start laughing uncontrollably, and then they go to sleep. But he can't. He seems to have some kind of psychotic break. He leaves this retreat, he goes back home to his wife, Alice, and she knows that something is off with him. Something doesn't seem right. She's asking him, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And all he says is, "I made a terrible mistake. Something went wrong. I ruined the experiment." And he won't elaborate on what that is. And so she's really concerned about him. The next day he goes to work, and his boss, this guy named Vincent Ruitt, who is at that retreat, he tells his boss, "I think you should fire me. Like I don't deserve this job. I ruined the experiment, something." And his boss is saying, "What are you talking about? Like you haven't done anything wrong." And the next day he says the same thing. He comes back to his boss's office. "No, I think you should fire me. Something's wrong." So he seems to be having some kind of mental instability, or something's happening precipitated by this LSD being put in his drink. So Ruitt is worried about him. So is Lashbrook and Gottlieb. They decide they're going to send him to a guy named Harold Abramson in New York, who is kind of a CIA affiliate, so he knows that these LSD experiments go on, but he's also, I think he's actually like an allergist, but they say he's a psychologist or something. Maybe he can help them in some way. So they send they send Olson to Abramson, and they start talking for a while. It turns out they had known each other from World War II. They had worked on a couple projects and knew each other from that. And then Lashbrook accompanies him up there. Once Lashbrook leaves the room, Olson says, "I think they're trying to put stuff in my food and drink. I've got this paranoid." He's paranoid.
He's breaking.
He's breaking, exactly. Yeah. So the next day is Thanksgiving. So they decide, well, we're going to take Olson back to Maryland, where he's from, to spend Thanksgiving with his family. So they fly back to Maryland. Once they get there, they haven't even gotten home yet, but he gets off the plane and he says, "Something's wrong. I think, the police are out to get me. Just send me to the police station. They're looking for me anyway." It's like, what are you talking about? Nobody's looking for you. So they decide, well, he's really not in the state to go be with his family right now. So one of the people who were accompanying him, they go tell Alice that we're going to take him back to New York. They end up taking him back to New York after that to meet with Abramson again. And Abramson decides, we need to commit you to like a psychiatric hospital because, something's wrong. He agrees to it, but the psychiatric hospital doesn't have any spare beds. And so they need to wait an extra day before they can go down to it. Okay, so they spend the next day in New York. They're kind of wasting time. And then that night they go to the Statler Hotel in New York. Him and Robert Lashbrook, they're going to, stay in the room together. And at 2:30 in the morning, he jumps out the window and he dies. He falls 10 floors to the 7th Avenue sidewalk and he dies. So that's the story of Frank Olson. There are a lot of potential explanations of what was going on. Frank Olson's son, Eric Olson, thinks that his father was murdered.
Yes.
He thinks that this was like a planned thing. The CIA wanted to kill his father, potentially because his father had moral qualms about what they were doing. Maybe they were kind of releasing biological agents somewhere, had harmed some people. Maybe they really had released biological agents on Korea during the Korean War, and he was having these pangs of conscience, and maybe he was going to go public about it or something like that, and so they offed him. So that's what Eric Olson thinks. I'm kind of skeptical of that. In fact, I am skeptical of that. I don't think that's what happened. I think Frank Olson did have some kind of psychotic break, and I do think he jumped out the window.
Could you see why they think he was killed, though?
Oh, yeah.
Because he had access before any break like this. He had access to some of the...
Yeah, there's certainly motive. There's certainly motive there. Yeah, it's just a question of, did anyone act on that motive? I don't think they did. One of the explanations that people will often give about how another supposed piece of proof that the CIA was involved in this and they killed Frank Olson is that in 1953, the year that this happened, there is a primer on assassinations that is created by the CIA talking about what are the best ways to kill someone. And one of the best ways, it says, is to push them out from a tall place so they can fall.
And then he gets out a
and
window.
that's what happened. Yeah. So that's one of the links people will use. Oh, well, obviously they knew this was a method of assassination that could potentially not lead to anyone being found out about it. So obviously this must have been what happened to him.
It doesn't mean guilt. That's a hell of a coincidence.
It doesn't mean guilt.
But actually, in their defense on this one, that's not exactly a generational idea right there. I feel like that's been done throughout human history. People fall. They can't fly.
For me too, one of the things is, they didn't know that Frank Olson was going to want to go back to New York when they took him to Maryland. So they're going to have to set all this up, and then one day that he decides, no, actually, I want to go back to New York, and
or he didn't.
Yeah, or he didn't. That could be the case.
And they say, he wanted to go back. What do you know? Then he died.
That could be the case. Yeah.
We tried to bring him back to Maryland. He didn't want to do it.
Yeah. Well, I'm skeptical of that. But another thing too with Frank Olson, maybe it not something that makes me think that it wasn't an assassination, a murder, is that a lot of the other people who were surreptitiously dosed with LSD under these same projects reacted in the same way as Frank Olson did. So I mentioned that woman, Clarice Stein. She had the exact same kind of psychotic break. There are a few other people. I don't.
But was she threatening? And I don't know if he was either. I can't remember the case. Was that woman Clarice saying anything like what we're doing is wrong and people need to find out about this or something like that? Because I think, if I remember, it's been a while. I think that was the implication he was saying. Frank was saying stuff like that to people behind the scenes, like what we're doing is wrong. So they're worried, like you said, that he might say something. But the other people, maybe they weren't saying that. Maybe
She was not, because she didn't know about any of this. She was just some random woman who happened to be at the wrong party and got dosed with this stuff.
So that would be different.
But see, what I think of is, well, I don't even know if Frank Olson was actually saying that, So his son says that, he was having these pangs of conscience, but was he? I don't know if he was. Like, I don't think he
was his son again when he died?
He was maybe 9 years old, something like that. He was very young. Yeah.
So he wouldn't have like heavy conversations with his dad at that time.
No. At least, not. I'm assuming not about his work.
Not something he would understand or be able to process for sure. Yeah, that's interesting because also like Cy Hirsch, who's at the middle of that story, he tracked that for decades. But Cy is one of those guys. He builds some cases that are amazing and works on them for years and multi-source to the gills and everything, and it's like, oh, maybe there might be something here. And then there's other cases where he'll write 5,000-6,000 words on one source, anonymous, and it's not to say it's wrong, it's just like every time he's reporting on something, it's something insane. It's like, are all these true? Probably not, but some of them are, and it's kind of your best guess. But in his defense, like that's whenever you're reporting on these types of places, these agencies, that is how it is. You're gonna get somewhere. It's like this might actually be happening, and others like, yeah, maybe there's another explanation here.
And there's so many, I mentioned there are 149 subprojects. I have one chapter that's called Subprojects where I try to briefly explain some of the ones that I can't go into a lot of detail because I can't have a chapter on every single one.
That's why you're on the podcast. Let's go into some detail.
I wanted to bring up one of the more absurd ones, sad ones. It involves animal experimentation, but they were planning on putting... Oh, not planning. They did put electrodes into the brains of animals and stimulating in them in such a way that they can control their movements. So this was done with dogs and rats and several other kinds of animals. But it's Subproject 94. But you would implant this electrode and you would stimulate the pleasure center of the brain, is what it says in the kind of description of the subproject. And you actually, it worked. You actually could get a dog to walk in the pre-desired direction. So if there was, the researcher who's responsible for this would go to a grass field and kind of plot out in his mind an invisible path that the dog doesn't know, but okay, I want him to do a loop here and then go this way. And so, if the dog goes in the correct direction, the desired direction, you would stimulate that part of the brain, the pleasure center, as positive feedback. And so it would continue. If the dog moves in a different direction, you would stop the stimulation. And so the dog would continuously search for where the stimulation is. Once it finds it, it would then hone in on the correct path and go forward. So by doing this repeatedly, you could get it to walk in a pre-desired path. You could do this with rats too. It was done. And some of the crazier documents that I found about MKUltra involves this subproject where they're trying to explain what are they trying to do here? So in these documents, they mention that ultimately we want to use this for, and this is their quote, executive action type operations, which is obviously like assassination attempts. Right. And they say we want to try to put biological and chemical weapons on these animals and then steer them in the desired direction to get close to a target, and then that's going to kill them in some way. What animals are wanting to be used? They said bears and yaks are the most desirable animals because they can carry really heavy payloads. So if we can get a bear, I'm guessing
how you getting a bear close to a president?
I have no clue. This is the thing. Not that this was actually done, but in the documents, they're kind of speculating on what our desired thing is. And at the end of the documents, it says our ultimate goal is to apply this to humans, basically. We want to see if, we could do this. Not that they ever did, but that was kind of the ultimate goal. This is like the real-life Manchurian Candidate. Can we stimulate someone's brain in order to make them move in a desired direction like a marionette? Yeah, so that was one of the crazier subprojects.
The idea, though, at the beginning of MKUltra, like you said, was they had a suspicion that Koreans were controlling minds or something in the war when they were torturing prisoners. And as you put it, and everyone said this, that turned out not to be true. Mm-hmm. That said, Is it possible that maybe there's some things they figured out in MK Ultra that we don't know about? That like this is a bit of a facade to put up. Like, yeah, we tried this thing, it was fucked up. We had to admit about it, and yeah, it's ancient history now. But, you know, there's another section called MK Ultra Plus Plus where, you know, they actually did figure out how to fucking control the mind and have been doing stuff like that.
Yeah, there are a couple things to say about that. Mind control is possible, but not in the way that MK Ultra thought it would be. So I'll touch on that in a second, because at the very end of the book, I say, you know, Sidney Gottlieb may not have developed methods of mind control, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. And here's kind of how they do. So I'll return to that in a second.
I was concerned, by the way, when you were saying animals, that you were going to say pigeons.
Oh, pigeon? Is that like your favorite animal or something?
You know, the conspiracy theory, pigeons are just drones. So I'm like, and they walk right up next to you, you know? I'm a big pigeon defender, by the way, so I don't think that, but my buddy Mark Gagnon.
The birds aren't real kind of
dynamic. Yeah. He's always like, they're not real, and the pigeons are very dumb. And I'm like, no, they're actually very smart, you know? So you never know. But please continue on what you were saying.
I don't think it's the case that MK Ultra found methods of mind control in the sense that you could make someone do something you wanted them to do actively. Like if we wanted to make someone assassinate someone else, they didn't find ways to make someone do that like against their will or something. What they did do is find ways to discredit someone or make them go insane or seeming like they went insane by slipping them LSD. One of the plots that Sidney Gottlieb is involved in, besides all the assassination plots on Fidel Castro, there's one plot to, why don't we gift him cigars that have been laced with LSD right before he's going to give a big speech or something? So he's going to, you know, suck on these cigars. He's going to get hit with this stuff. He's going to go on an acid trip, and he's going to start spewing all this nonsense, and people are going to lose their faith in him because, oh, this guy's crazy. Like, how can we trust him? He's going insane. So you can make someone appear insane like that. You can manipulate them in that way, but not in a controlled way to make them do something, at least not with the methods that Sidney Gottlieb is involved in, especially drugs and hypnosis. That being said, there were some useful things, like active positive things, not positive in the sense that good, positive in the sense that you could actively do it, that came from MK Ultra. One of them had to do with a sub-project that's conducted by this psychologist named Martin Orne, and it involved interrogations. How do we get someone to reveal the truth in an interrogation? The goal of MK Ultra was to develop a truth drug, but it turns out there's not really a truth drug that all of a sudden you're going to take it and now I'm going to spill all my secrets. Right. You can lower someone's inhibitions, you know, and you can, I mean, people have known for thousands of years, you can do that with wine, just some alcohol, and you're going to lower your inhibitions, and they might say something they otherwise might not have.
Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.